Okay. So our second lectionary reading is from the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood at the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, do you love me?" Simon was hurt, Peter was hurt, because Jesus asked him the third time. And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peace be with you. And thank you so much for having me as your guest today. I feel truly honored. Today is the third Sunday of Easter. So our lectionary readings are about a couple of the most significant post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. They're significant because they deal primarily with what are arguably the two most important individuals in the founding era of the church, Peter and Paul. But one of these two denied Jesus while he was alive, while the other was a persecutor and tormentor of the disciples of Jesus, right up until the day when he became converted to becoming a follower of Jesus. So the two resurrection appearances we're reading about today are also important because they illustrate how the risen Jesus dealt with traitors and tormentors, those who displayed the kind of persecutory zeal that led to his crucifixion, as well as those who turned their backs on him in his darkest hour. So ask yourself, if you were Jesus, come back from the dead, how would you deal with these people? Yeah, me too. The authorities had expected the crucifixion of Jesus to put an end to this new movement by essentially decapitating it. But now it seemed to be getting stronger than ever, gaining new recruits by the day. Among those who were alarmed at the growth of this heterodox sect was a devout Jew named Saul from the city of Tarsus in what is present-day Turkey. Saul, who later adopted the Roman name Paul, the name by which we know him best, was a brilliant and highly learned member of a branch of Judaism known as the Pharisees. He was, by his own description, loyal and zealous to the traditions of his father. In other words, he was one of the good guys, doing God's work. And in Saul's mind, the bad guys were the followers of Jesus, with their false teaching that was drawing people away from the truth. In order to put an end to this dangerous movement, Saul took it upon himself to harass and torment the followers of the new sect in hopes of putting an end to their dangerous movement. Saul may be doing evil, but he's acting with a clear conscience in the belief that he's doing good. He's making the world better. So here he comes down the road, breathing threats and murder against the disciples of Jesus, whom the high priest had commissioned him to bind and bring to Jerusalem. We all know what happens next. It's an event that has often been described as Paul's conversion from being a persecutor to becoming one of Jesus' most famous and influential apostles. But the question I want us to consider is exactly at what point in the story does the conversion actually take place? So first there's the blinding light, causes a startled Saul to fall off his horse, and then he hears a voice. And the voice says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" A voice that will identify itself in a moment later as belonging to the resurrected Jesus. There are a couple things we should note about these words. First, the text reports Jesus' words to Saul, but it doesn't tell us how they were said. Was it a booming voice issuing a stern rebuke? A thundering voice of apocalyptic fury, causing Saul to tremble in fear? After all, Saul was breathing threats and murder, or, as it is rendered in another translation that I like, snorting out menace and slaughter. So it's easy to imagine the voice as answering Saul's own bloodthirsty rage in kind. But I hear something different. In the repetition of Saul's name, Saul, Saul, I hear something plaintive, like the voice of hurt and confusion a lover might express on receiving ill treatment at the hands of the one he or she loves. "Saul, Saul," says Jesus, as if pleading with someone he dearly loves. "Why do you hurt me like this? Why do you torment me when all I feel is love for you?" Haven't we all been there, at one time or another, feeling mistreated by someone we love, but still loving him or her through our hurt. Jesus doesn't meet Saul's anger with more anger of his own. Rather, he exposes his heart to Saul in all of its vulnerability and long-suffering love. Paul's blindness when he gets off the ground dramatizes the extent to which his world has been shattered. Every frame of reference on which he had formerly relied, including his absolute certainty that he was one of the good guys, has been cast aside. He is now a man without a guidance system. Most likely, he has never felt so vulnerable, so lost at any previous point in his life. So Jesus responds with a set of directions to guide him. He should allow his attendants to lead him by the hand into Damascus and to await further instructions. The scene shifts at this point to a disciple of Jesus in Damascus named Ananias. Ananias is one of those followers of the way whom Saul had come to the city to place in bonds and transport back to Jerusalem. Saul's name is not unknown to Ananias, and we might well imagine he doesn't have a lot of love to spare for this persecutor of Jesus. But Ananias receives a vision in which Jesus dispatches him to the house where Saul is staying and directs him to lay hands on him so that his sight can be restored. It's hard not to sense more than a little resistance on the part of Ananias. After all, he's being asked to come to the assistance of a man he knows to be his mortal enemy. But in the end, he obeys. Now recall that I asked earlier at what point in the story Saul is converted. I believe it was at the very moment when Ananias, acting on behalf of Jesus, laid his hands on Saul and cured him of his blindness. Now imagine you're Saul, blind, defenseless. And here comes one of the men against whom you had been breathing threats and murder. He knows who you are, and he knows your lethal mission. This is the last person into whose hands you would want to fall. Ananias could have taken revenge on Saul at the moment of his most extreme vulnerability, and there would have been nothing Saul could have done to prevent him. That's probably what Saul expected. But he received healing instead. And it's at this moment, I believe, that Saul is converted. So, how does Jesus deal with his tormentors? He loves them. He just loves them. Peter's story, well, Peter is someone who has betrayed his best friend, and not only a friend. Jesus was the person in whom Peter had invested his highest hopes, the person whom he believed would be the Savior of Israel. But after the arrest of Jesus, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, no doubt out of fear that he too could be arrested and made to suffer a similar fate. Peter's denial of Jesus is told in all 4 of the Gospels. But John, the Gospel of John, that's where our reading was from today, John tells it a little different than the other evangelists. In Matthew and Luke, Peter is asked whether he knows Jesus. And 3 times he says, "I do not know him." But in John, the question posed to Peter as he warms himself by a charcoal fire in the high priest's courtyard, the question is, Aren't you one of the man's disciples? To which Peter replies, I am not. In other words, Peter is not just denying Jesus. He's betraying himself, denying the relationship on which his entire identity had been built. Saul was convinced he was one of the good guys. But Peter's situation is different, since he carried with him the guilt and shame of his betrayal. Can we relate to that? Haven't we all at one time or another let ourselves down, let others down? We've seen how Jesus deals with his tormentors and persecutors. But how does he deal with traitors? Those who betray what they claim to believe. Saul at least had the excuse that he thought he was doing the right thing. Peter knew what was right, but out of weakness and fear, he betrayed both himself and his friend. Today's lectionary reading from the Gospel of John takes place after the resurrection of Jesus. 7 of the disciples are gathered in the evening at the Sea of Galilee when Peter abruptly announces, I'm going fishing. He evidently had planned to go off alone, but the others insisted on tagging along. Maybe they were worried about him. They fish all night, but as the sun rises, they haven't a single fish to show for all their efforts. Then Jesus appears on the shore, though they don't recognize him at first, and he gives them some fishing advice, tells them where to cast their nets. And they haul in 153 fish. We're not told how they know the number. Did they count them? Maybe they had to keep records for the tax man. In any case, once they realize that the stranger on the shore is Jesus, Peter casts himself into the water and swims to shore, while the others struggle to haul in that bonanza of a catch. When they land on the beach, there's Jesus, grilling up some fish for breakfast over a charcoal fire. After a long night on the lake, to come to shore and find someone cooking breakfast for you, that must feel great. But that's probably not how Peter experienced it. Remember, Peter was standing at a charcoal fire the night when he denied Jesus and betrayed himself 3 times. So to see Jesus' face reflected in the glow of those charcoal embers, well, that must have been devastating for Peter. And then comes the questioning. Just as Peter denied Jesus 3 times at that previous charcoal fire, so too Jesus 3 times poses the same question to Jesus. Do you love me? What a poignant question. How many times have we asked this question of a loved one? Or not asked, but wondered? And how many affirmative answers does it take to convince us after we've suffered a terrible betrayal? But this question, do you love me, is really much more than just a question. It is itself a confession of love. Do you love me as I love you? Like Jesus' question to Saul, it is not an accusation, though Peter takes it that way. But it's an expression of Jesus' own vulnerability and long-suffering love, a love that may be pained by Peter's betrayal, but can never be extinguished. Jesus asked 3 times to allow Peter to cancel out his 3 denials with 3 declarations of love. And each time Peter declares his love, Jesus responds in a way that restores Peter to his disavowed identity as a disciple. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Peter is restored to a relationship with Jesus that he had betrayed, just as Paul was invited into a new relationship with the one whom he had persecuted and tormented. Jesus does not rebuke them, though they may have rebuked themselves for their own ignorance and weakness, since that had for a time closed them off from Jesus' unconditional love. They may have felt deep remorse at having been so wrong, but also deep joy at being put right. But there's something else that might strike us as odd about how Jesus deals with this traitor and this tormentor. At no point do we hear him say to either of them, "I forgive you." He simply takes the initiative to repair the broken relationship, even though he wasn't the one who broke it. He doesn't need to say, "I forgive you." He simply loves in the same way he always has. A love in the light of which we can admit our failings, because we know there is no condemnation. A love experienced as forgiveness, because it doesn't hold those failings against us. In preparing this sermon and in thinking about how Jesus loved Peter and Paul, I was put in mind of a song by Bob Dylan titled "Make You Feel My Love." You may know the Adele version, the inferior Adele version. The song goes, in part, "I'd go hungry, I'd go black and blue, I'd go crawling down the avenue. There's nothing that I wouldn't do to make you feel my love." Are there people in our lives who have betrayed or tormented us? Are we able to extend our love to them in the same healing way that Jesus loved those who betrayed and tormented him? How far might we be willing to go to make them feel our love, as Jesus did for Peter and Paul?